There is a well-known saying that goes always give the hardest job to the laziest person because they will find the easiest way to do it. What is the best real-life example to this you have seen? There's a story that I've heard a few dozen times about a toothpaste company that had accidentally sent out cases of their product that had a few empty single boxes of toothpaste. The company had endeavored not only to rectify their mistake, but to ensure they did not repeat it. They hired an engineering company that designed a scale and alarm shutdown system. If an empty carton was passed down the production line, klaxons would be triggered and a full stop would initiate until the offending box was recovered and an all clear had been entered into the computer system before production could resume. The company paid through the nose, but was ultimately pleased with their failsafe, and the engineers patted each other on the back. A few months pass, and the engineers returned for quality control. The toothpaste company reported zero margin of error for weeks. Turns out, one of the minimum wage hairnet types on the assembly line didn't appreciate the sound of klaxons or working with computers. So, he or she had aimed a large fan at the production line before the scale that blew the lighter empty cartons off of the conveyor belt. Problem solved. During my intern, my professor gave me line graphs made on paper and asked me to find the coordinates by drawing horizontal and vertical lines. It would have taken hours, if not days. I thought to myself, I couldn't be the first one who is lazy AF. So I googled it, found this cool free to use software web digitizer point. Step 1, scan the graph. Step 2, mark the x and y axis in the picture. Step 3, grab a beer cause you got the nicest MF graph that you couldn't have drawn by yourself in a million years. My professor was so happy she asked me to document the method and mail it across the entire department. Edit. I'm so sorry people for not replying earlier. I had no idea this would blow up, so I didn't bother to check Reddit at work. To answer your question, yes, I did share my original method with my professor and the entire department. 1. She was a really supportive professor and I wanted to return her favors, even if this software might have been the tiniest help to her work. 2. The original developer of this software made it available online for free. He could have made it a paid service, and believe me, researchers would have paid, because it is that good. But he kept it free for all of us to use, and it was my responsibility to share his work as much as I could. Link for those interested to try this software. Cheers to the developer, Ankit Rahaji. I used to process HSA claims around 10 plus years ago. One system we had to use back then was an old as hell terminal program that took 4 line items per page. That's it. For a usual claim, no big deal. Not too hard to keep track of things over 2 or 3 pages. For a longer claim, most fit on 1 point. However, we had the dreaded showbox claims. This was the person who saved up every receipt all year in a metaphorical showbox and sent everything in once a year to empty their account. We hated them. Dozens or hundreds of line items totaling thousands of dollars. Just because you only had $500 in your HSA doesn't mean we get to stop there. If you sent in $4,000 in receipts, I got her account for it all. Totally killed your numbers for the day, and they tracked claims per hour religiously. The main issue was double checking that everything added up right when you were done entering it. At 4 items a page it took forever to tally. So, I made an Excel sheet. It was laid out so I could enter every single line, then run a macro that would calculate the needed totals and dump all the text to a text file, formatted exactly so I could select 4 items at a time and paste them directly into the terminal window from the default starting cursor position, and every field would fill in automatically. Copy, paste, next, copy, paste, next, copy, paste, next, etc. It easily halved my entry times, with way less work. Finding any typos was much easier. I just had to look at one column organized sheet instead of scrolling through God knows how many pages of terminal text. It was great. I showed it to my manager, so the rest of my team could use it. She was horrified I would use something like that, as no human was double checking as they went along. This despite demonstrable improvements to my error rates on large claims. After I started using it, She ordered me to stop using it and forbid anyone in her team from automating any part of their job at all. I kept using it for all of the 2 months I stayed there after that. I had some of the highest claim per hour numbers and lowest error rates on her team. I never developed any more tools for them. Fuck her. Be nice to your build engineers. They know how to take the easy road. Here's the full text for those scrolling by. XXX. Okay, so, our build engineer has left for another company. The dude was literally living inside the terminal. You know, that type of a guy who loves Vim, creates diagrams in Dot, and writes wiki posts in Markdown. If something, anything, requires more than 90 seconds of his time, he writes a script to automate that. XXX. So we are sitting here, looking through his UHM legacy. XXX. You're gonna love this. Smack my beach up. Punch. Sends a text message late at work to his wife. Apparently, automatically picks reasons from an array of strings, randomly, runs inside a cron job. The job fires if there are active SSH sessions on the server after 9 PM with his login. XXX. Kumara as whole. Scans the inbox for emails from Kumara DBA at our clients. Looks for keywords like help, trouble, sorry, etc. If keywords are found, the script shares into the client server and rolls back the staging database to the latest backup. Then sends a reply, no worries mate, be careful next time. XXX. Hangover. Another cron job that is set to specific dates. Sends automated emails like not feeling well / gonna work from home, etc. Adds a random reason from another predefined array of strings. Fires if there are no interactive sessions on the server at 8:45 AM. XXX. And the Oscar goes to fucking coffee. This one waits exactly 17 seconds, then opens an SSH session to our coffee machine. We had no freaking idea the coffee machine is on the network, runs Linux and has SSHD up and running, and sends some weird gibberish to it. Looks binary. Turns out this thing starts brewing a mid-sized half-ca flat and waits another 24 seconds before pouring it into a cup. The timing is exactly how long it takes to walk to the machine from the dude's desk. XXX. Holy shit, I'm keeping those. A few years ago my mom was tasked with fixing my grandparents' toilet while we were visiting for the holidays. The toilet reservoir was constantly filling and running, and thus flooding the bathroom, because the boy arm wasn't lifting high enough from the water in the reservoir to switch off the water flow. My mom, who is normally a very practical person, had been tackling the issue for hours. She was pretty distraught, thinking we would have to order a new boy arm, maybe even a new sensor, or switch and pull the whole assembly apart to replace everything. She was planning out a trip to Lowe's and pricing things out. When I walked in. I took one look at it and bent the metal arm the boy was attached to down, so the arm had a slight upwards curve. The boy still reached the same level in the reservoir, but registered on the sensor as higher because of the curve in the arm. Problem solved. Rangers lead the way. I watched it dawn on her what I had done, and she just looked at me like I had a third eye and said, you little faking sheet. I've been getting my ass kicked by this thing for 4 hours and you fixin' in 4 faking seconds. She was very happy I saved her from more work and spending more money. She calls me her little toilet engineer from time to time. I work on aircraft. It's mildly demeaning. Edit. And now my most upvoted comment is about a sheeter I fixed once. Perfect. Got hired into a plant that just got a big new job building stuff for the military. My job was materials associate, which basically meant I drove a forklift and staged parts that were built. The engineers came up with a floor plan for all of the parts and where they needed to be staged. They used fancy lasers and measuring devices and built it all in CAD. After telling them it wouldn't work, they said, well, let's see you do a better job. I organized the entire 50,000 SQ/FT warehouse so that each part was close to the machines that use them. It followed the first in first out method, and each department knew where their parts went when they were done making them, put up signs and whatnot. After that my job was basically pointless because the warehouse ran itself. I decided to teach myself how to use the welding robots in my downtime. Fast forward 3 years and now I'm an automation engineer at one of the largest parts supplier in the industry. PS. Robots are very easy to learn and operate if you're struggling to find what you want to do in your career. Places are hiring with minimal experience too cause there is a huge lack of people in the automation field. Get a 1-year college certification in mechatronics and you can make around 40-60k starting depending on location. Edit. A lot of you showed interest in getting into this field. I made a very thorough posting on r/job profiles. If you would like to learn more about getting into this field and what to expect, check it out here. I used to have to make two contracts for every person I brought on a traveling training team. I said two contracts was stupid and made them into one, sent it to our lawyers, and they approved it. Still took me too goddamn long to update each contract with different names, pay rates, and dates. Went on r/Excel and found out how to make a mailer list and hours of work takes me 10 minutes. I didn't tell anyone this though, so I just take my time. Then I had to make floor maps for restaurants to send to the company that puts them into our scheduling program. Well, all of our restaurants are cookie cutter, so I just use Paint to piece them together rather than make all of them each time. Fake and Picasso with Microsoft Paint. Then they wanted me to use Excel to keep track of training teams. One of my coworkers used Smartsheet and loves to teach people things. So I jump on Smartsheet with her and she shows me around. Way easier and easier publishing it so that people can see the teams but not mess up any info. Using forms to not have to ask them 30 questions that auto-populate my Smartsheet. Sharing it with payroll so they never have to reach out to me. Templates on Outlook. Tons of stuff. I basically took a lot of my job, said fuck that there has to be an easier way, asked on Reddit or just googled things. And spend maybe an hour learning something that will save me many hours in the future. I always tell people to just Google things. They say I don't know what to Google, and I say whatever your problem is just Google it the exact same way you'd say it to me. Then when they Google Excel thing that makes this do that, they are shocked that they find their answer. I did more or less the same thing, but it ended up working. Got a high school group project to research and write about the economic development of the country of Chile, which is actually quite interesting if you're into economics, but a bit complicated for a group of high school kids. This was in the 1980s, so we couldn't just Google it. We were trying to figure out how to find, basically, anything. When I came up with writing the Chilean embassy, we got a pretty thorough answer from a dude there, answering most of the questions we had, with a copy of a scientific article he was using as a source. Also, a sheaf of nice tourism and export brochures we could cut some pictures out of to use as illustrations for the final project. We divvied up the writing. Me and the girl, who also seemed at least semi-interested in trying to dig into some parts of the included article, took the hard parts. Other two did the intro and the layout. Just for fun, I wrote an extra page about Chilean cuisine and one about Chilean wine. Both were sourced from stuff I could pick up without walking more than 20 feet, because my dad collected books about cooking and wine. I was once on a US military ship, having breakfast in the wardroom, officer's lounge, when the operations officer, ops, walks in. This guy was the definition of not a morning person. He's still half asleep, bleary-eyed, basically a zombie with a badgel. He sits down across from me to eat his badgel, and is just barely conscious. My back is to the outboard side of the ship, and the morning sun is blazing in one of the portholes, putting a big bright ass circle of light right on his barely conscious face. He's squinting and chewing, and basically just remembering how to be alive for today. It's painful to watch. But then zombie ops stops chewing, slowly picks up the phone, and dials the bridge. In his well-known "I'm still totally asleep" voice, he says, "Hey, it's ops. Could you shift our barput? Yeah, 165. Thanks," and puts the phone down. And then he just sits there, squinting, waiting. And then, ever so slowly, I realize that that big blazing spot of sun has begun to slide off the zombie's face and onto the wall behind him. After a moment it clears his face, and he blinks slowly a few times, and the brilliant beauty of what I've just witnessed begins to overwhelm me. By ordering the bridge to adjust the ship's back and forth patrol by about 15 degrees, he's changed our course just enough to reposition the sun off of his face. He's literally just redirected thousands of tons of steel and hundreds of people so that he could get the sun out of his eyes while he eats his badgel. I'm an point. He slowly picks up his badge, and for a moment I'm terrified at the thought that his own genius may escape him, that he may never appreciate the epic brilliance of his laziness, since he's not going to wake up for another hour. But between his next bites he pauses, looks at me, and gives me the faintest sly grin, before returning to gnaw slowly on his zombie badge. In high school I had an absolute as of a teacher. He gave me a binder that had the name, address, phone of every student in the entire district, including the names of all of their siblings. I was to type this in, even though it was already printed out. I asked, if it was already printed, why was I typing it? He said they paid an outside firm a bunch of money to do it, but the state pulled the funding and the firm refused to provide the files, and now the district didn't have the money to do it again, but they still needed the data. I was super pissed about how tedious of a job I was given and beached to no end. He knew that I was the winner of a typing contest and agreed that this one project would be my entire grade for the semester. If I could manage to get it all entered into the computer by the end of the year, I'd get a passing grade. If not, I'd fail. After about 2 hours of data entry, I decided it was a bullshit job and downloaded OCR software, scanned the whole thing in, and spent a day or two correcting scanning mistakes. My plan was to spend the rest of the semester goofing off and pretending to work. That lasted about a week before the teacher caught on. He then proceeded to start giving me more stupid tedious work and said the previous deal was now off. I found out that part of the reason the deal with the consulting firm ended badly was his fault, and told him I was going to the school board with this information. We decided on a new plan. My grade for the semester would pass as an A, but I had free time to take on other classes the teacher offered. I used this free time to complete 1.5 other courses TLDR. My laziness got me 2.5 course credits in the span of time I would have gotten only 1. My buddy wasn't so much lazy as he abhorred inefficiency. So nearly 20 years ago he worked for a company that sold slightly differing models of widgets. His job was a secondary inventory of what widgets were in stock. Primary was based on receiving and sales, and it was tracked with a long barcode. Widgets were stored in a warehouse and might be pulled by a salesperson to show a customer. Inventory was weekly and would take that long to collect, compile, and submit it the manual way his boss and predecessor managed the process. Back in the early 2000s, Palm had the handheld computing market covered, and my buddy was pondering a future in technology. He approached his boss about purchasing a Palm device and a barcode scanner to modernize the process. He was denied, based on cost/benefit, since he was making minimum wage to do a basic thing and there wasn't anything else he could be doing. My buddy says screw it, buys equipment and spends his evenings making a really shitty app that will dump the info into Excel. He adds a couple additions like warehouse location to the data input/output and calls it good. He asks his boss to start working early on Mondays. Boss figures why not, since receiving is already there. Buddy walks the warehouse with his device scanning away, doing 3 days worth of work in just under 8 hours. He leaves around normal people's lunch and goes home to dump the raw data. He spends the afternoon tinkering with the data output and eventually has a fully functional system. Tuesday at start of business he hands the manager the weekly report. Manager is obviously shocked until my friend showed him what he had done. Manager pauses, not knowing what to think, and allows him a half day at full pay since he worked at home last night. Wednesday my buddy asks if there's anything else he could be doing to help out. He gets sat with the web design team and starts doing more techy stuff there. Thursday manager asks for another full report, which is annoying because widgets can move around during business hours, but he gets it done. Friday his manager has another report and my friend goes back to work with the web team. So my buddy has made his position all but redundant and he's developing HTML skills. He eventually finds a new job more in line with his talents. His manager of course asks for the hardware/software that's been in use over the last several months. My buddy offers to sell it to him, but the manager doesn't see it that way. He sees it as an in-house, developed thing that the company owns. My buddy laughs, since he has the receipts for the hardware and the developed code on his home PC. My buddy leaves and ignores subsequent calls from his old boss. Inventory returned to being a weekly task that consumed the entire week. My buddy still hates inefficiency to the point where he automates as many things as possible. https://xkcd.com/1319/ is very apt in his life. I work for a major software development company, but the work I do is primarily electrical/mechanical work to maintain one of the massive data centers that keeps the internet alive. The company creates all of its own tools for literally everything instead of using off-the-shelf products. The issue was that, even though we made our tools, we had a different tool for each portion of a given task. One task would require 5 different tools that didn't talk to each other just to complete the admin portion. I was tired of having to navigate each tool individually, so I decided I was going to make them talk to each other through a different tool. I taught myself the necessary languages and spent my free time for a few weeks creating my product. The end result was a tool that I could manage 100% of my daily administrative work from one tab in a web browser, resulting in admin time being cut to about 10% of what it was, and reduced the amount of missed work due to some automated functions that would highlight things that didn't get done in time. I did all of this as a glorified electrician with no previous experience, even though we employed 10k plus software engineers. Suck it, nerds. Then I realized that software development is a bit of a passion of mine, and now I'm trying to pivot careers. Edit. Since we have a salty boy below, I'd like to make it very clear that I don't actually believe I did the coding portion of their job better than they could. What I did have was specific knowledge on the best way to view information, and a desire to not wait around for them to institute feature requests that were buried in their backlog. Since doing my work, it has put into perspective just how important some of the features I built into my product were, and they have since pivoted their entire project plan to focus more on integrating the features I created into our actual tools. I didn't mean to hurt anyone's feelings. I've got mad respect for anyone who manages to create anything useful out of code. Okay, this is my dad's story, so every technical term I'm gonna use is probably going to be wrong. My dad was a carpenter for most of his life, and after about 20 years in the business, he knew a good deal about the hardcore stuff, never mind the beginner level stuff. So one day he's working with a new kid who's clipping protruding male ends off with a pair of wire cutting pliers, and my dad gave him shit for not wearing safety glasses and leaning too close. My dad demonstrates gripping the end with the plier, leaning away, then clipping the nail to avoid it flying into your eyes. Kid nods and moves on, and whatever. Next day, my dad comes to his toolkit, and his pliers are taped shut, and the kid had put a dab of silicone on the opposite side of the cutting part of the pliers. My dad, who gets pissed easy, was pissed. Till the kid came over, untapped them, cut the silicone dab down the middle with an X-Acto, and gripped it to the end of a protruding nail. Then leaned close enough that his eye was an inch from the nail. The end usually flies off like high speed, but the nail was gripped between the silicone while also being allowed to cut, so the nail end stayed safely between the silicone. Long story for little payoff. From a previous AskReddit, the laziest sailor, not mine. I was once on a US military ship, having breakfast in the wardroom, officer's lounge, when the operations officer, Ops, walks in. This guy was the definition of not a morning person. He's still half asleep, bleary-eyed, basically a zombie with a badgel. He sits down across from me to eat his badgel, and is just barely conscious. My back is to the outboard side of the ship, and the morning sun is blazing in one of the portholes, putting a big bright ass circle of light right on his barely conscious face. He's squinting and chewing, and basically just remembering how to be alive for today. It's painful to watch. But then Zombie Ops stops chewing, slowly picks up the phone, and dials the bridge. In his well-known "I'm still totally asleep" voice, he says, "Hey, it's Ops. Could you shift our Apache Air 165? Thanks." And puts the phone down. And then he just sits there, squinting, waiting. And then, ever so slowly, I realize that that big blazing spot of sun has begun to slide off the zombie's face and onto the wall behind him. After a moment it clears his face, and he blinks slowly a few times, and the brilliant beauty of what I've just witnessed begins to overwhelm me. By ordering the bridge to adjust the ship's back and forth patrol by about 15 degrees, he's changed our course just enough to reposition the sun off of his face. He's literally just redirected thousands of tons of steel and hundreds of people so that he could get the sun out of his eyes while he eats his bajal. I'm in awe. He slowly picks up his bajal, and for a moment I'm terrified at the thought that his own genius may escape him, that he may never appreciate the epic brilliance of his laziness, since he's not going to wake up for another hour. But between his next bites he pauses, looks at me, and gives me the faintest sly grin, before returning to gnaw slowly on his zombie bajal. I worked for a tiny little software firm as a data entry operator. My job was to break down a long as address in Excel into multiple bits like address 1, address 2, address 3, city, postcode, phone number etc. There was so much data and we were getting paid 40 pounds per entry. This was around in 2004 to 2005. I had just finished my secondary school and was working part-time to have a side income. I didn't own a computer and all I knew about Excel was that one can type stuff in it in different cells. So my lazy ass wanted to make things faster, make more money. So I started playing with data menu and filter things, and I stumbled open filter and option contains where I put in part of address and I get 100s of their work similar addresses, and I used to be able to do 100s of lines of rows in a minute, which is like 40 rupees in minutes. This was cause so many times the addresses in the data were almost same, just one number changed in it, like flat 1, blah blah blah, flat 2, blah blah blah. I would end up doing around 1500 entries a day, which would make me Rs 600 daily, which was for me quite a big income, while others around would do 300 to 400 entries maximum. My boss there got impressed by it and asked me to do Oracle SQL course so I can join his actual company as technical support executive. And from there I learned so much and it basically shaped my career. Right now I'm a senior software engineer in a reputed company in London. Former fry cook here. I used to come into work to a mess. Nothing was done. Food was low. Employees running around like chickens with their heads cut off. And stress because of customers coming up to order food they failed to get out. I figured out a way to make more food at the right times, keep other products coming out for the host cases, and had those ovens constantly running until 7 PM. I also cleaned as I went along and shut down one fryer early around 4 or 5 PM on slow days so I could get out faster. My manager hated this and cut my hours as a result, but beamed on how clean the hot side deli was. I even cleaned things twice so I wouldn't have to do it all at once. I was not well liked because I wasn't sitting or standing around waiting for a customer. The fry cook is always busy and responsible for keeping that side of the deli running. Even with all the help I did get from coworkers that did care and all the extra work I had to do, I still kept my cool and got things done and was usually out by 9:30 or 10 PM when I was on the schedule until 11 PM. I needed to be home so I could rest and come back the next day. As a result my hours were cut in half because I wasn't doing enough. I had an easy job and anyone could do it. People were just lazy. I looked like I wasn't doing anything but was just efficient and prepping for the next day so I could go home. If you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to want a gallon of milk. I hate lazy people who don't do anything. I got punished for doing my job and lazy people got rewarded. I hope Fred Mears is the next grocery store to be bought by a Korean company. Fat Kroger. I worked in hospitality at a franchise that constantly looked at your performance for upselling items and your average amount spent per customer. People that got high sales per seated customer were automatically verbally praised in front of other floor staff, and if you weren't in the top 3, you had further heat put on you. Now this is where it gets tricky. My manager was known for constantly seating couples with children in my section. The couples would order $30 to $40 of food and drinks for the adults, and one $9.90 kids meal deal per kid. So obviously per person, I'm not going to get the sales I would if I had say 6 adults on a table. This new guy starts. He gets praised for getting on average something crazy like $45 on average for every single customer of his tables. Even though he was a sub per server at best, never regularly checked in on customers. The manager starts frothing on his sales figure, telling all of us we should be more like him. His massive ego gets boosted further. One day, I asked him how he did it. how he kept getting statistically high sales per customer. Turns out, after plonking into the computer system that persons 12 were getting adult meals alcohol, whilst 3 to 5 were kids getting cheap meal deals, he'd send the order through to the kitchen. Then, log back in, and move the kids' meals onto the adult seats, thus boosting his customer sales average. Which is a problem when the franchise is using those statistics to average how many customers they get each day/week/month. Sometimes, he'd move the parents' alcoholic beverages, for instance multiple beers and cocktails, with all the entrees onto the kids' seats, as to raise the kids' average spending amount, so suspicion wasn't raised. It's a little bit of a read, but a good one. Know your worth. Sometimes it's good to be the guy that asks for things. When money's concerned, if it costs them less, they'll pay. My first job out of engineering school was a contractor at a mine. We were tasked with transferring data and inventory and such from one program into Oracle. The program they had been using was designed by IBM when they were small fish and there was no way to transfer the data automatically or in batches. Excel wasn't around when IBM came up with the program, so no crossover or export function whatsoever. Anyways, my job was the mechanical parts. Anything from pumps, belt drives, bucket elevators, etc. It was all tedious data entry most days, but when information was missing, a trip to the mine or mill was an order and half the equipment was corroded and left for dead and illegible, so parts of equal performance had to be designed in their place so we could inventory them. The first week there was a guy that was just cruising, like I'm talking 800 to 900 lines a day. He grew up in the mining town and was basically groomed to work at the mine since day one. He knew his sheet. I could only hit about 500 lines a day until the first weekend, when I spent the entire weekend trying to find a better way to transfer the data. After the first week I realized that it was all a sequence of command tabs and copy pastes. Made a macro in Excel sheet the bed for the first few days of the second week, then boom. Figured out a way to do 10 lines at a time. Then found a way to do 100 at a time. There was probably a better way to go about it, but that was good enough for me. Anyways, before long, I had caught up to the data hero in the room and managed to surpass his record. I could smash it if I wanted, but chose to play the long game. Every day we'd post our numbers, then the next day I'd top his previous day by about 100 or so lines. I'd run the macro in the mornings few times and get a bunch of data in the sheet. By break time I'd be sampling lines to see if data was correct. By lunch I'd be in the mine if I needed to be. Majority of the time the lines were full and no visits were necessary, and I'd YouTube all day. Fast forward 9 or so months later, me thinking I'm so smart decides to leave early. Says I'll get all the lines done as I have around 45 to 50,000 left. Smash them out in 2 weeks. Before I leave, on my last day, put macro on a USB and clean up the interface a little with instructions. Give USB to boss and explain how I did it. He called me an idiot. We were good friends at this point. I mean, I was the star player and he chose to hire me in the first place, so he looked great. Saying if I brought this to him in the first 2 weeks of me arriving and offered to do all 11 people's jobs, numerous departments such as laboratory equipment, vehicles, a few more mechanicals, electrical, etc., for say 20k a piece, he would have been more than willing. He offered me a job in the future if I wanted, and we split ways. TLDR got hired as a data entry person for way too much money, made a macro, chose to play the slow game, pulled off what they thought were godlike data entry abilities, gave the macro to my boss on last day of work. Could have left that town 8 months early with more money than I made sticking it out. He also told me if I ever wanted to come back he's got a job waiting. Far from lazy, but I noticed a process at my last job that went similar to this. Document in file A, email to manager, get reply, add confirmation to spreadsheet, document reply in file B, upload to group folder, make a copy and upload to backup group folder. It was time consuming and stupid because all we got back from the manager was okay and the like, and nobody ever checked the spreadsheet. Ever. There were gaps, incorrect information, and half the time the spreadsheet was garbled. There was no need for it. So I just started saving the document in files A and B and skipped the rest. Eventually my supervisor's boss came over to ask me why I wasn't doing the rest of the process. Yes, my supervisor went to her boss instead of directly asking me. I explained that the process was stupid and wasted time and I just wasn't going to do anything but what I was doing. I told him that Vicky had made up this process for literally no reason or benefit. He had me write an email explaining the full process in detail and then went to my supervisor and told her process was stupid and a waste of time and we were changing the policy to just do what I was already doing. Vicky sucked and I shared other stories about her previously. On a lazy note, before I transferred under Vicky I was in the call center. I found out I could cut and pass 99% of call notes because they were for the same thing. I worked for an insurance company in the Medicare department and spoke with the elderly and or disabled. After about 6 months I realized that almost every call was a variation of one of about 7 issues. So I created a spreadsheet of generic notes to document the call with. Eventually the CAD department caught on, but liked the idea, so did my supervisor, so my notes became the standard, saving a large amount of time that was being used up with documenting the calls. Late to the party, but here we go. When I was a kid I used to work at Fox's Biscuits in Badley. Brits will know. It was back-breaking work. We used to be hunched over a conveyor belt processing biscuits, cookies to you Americans. We had to work at the speed of the machine, so we didn't even have time to stretch our backs and ease the pain. Just constantly hunched over. I noticed the packing machine would mess up from time to time, and the maintenance team had to come up to sort everything out. They would then stand at the machine when they got it working to see what was going wrong. They couldn't work it out, so then would leave until the machine messed up again. I was just a kid at the time and my back was killing me. I noticed the maintenance team trying to work out what kept messing the machine up, so I did the same. Only difference is I actually worked out what the problem was as the biscuit packets were coming through the machine. The design of the packets made some of them interlink which threw the packing machine off. So I did what came natural to a kid. I would purposefully interlink the packets. This gave everyone half-hour breaks while the maintenance team tried to sort things out. I was a hero to my people. When it comes to programming there is a thing called libraries. They're like a collection of software that does a defined thing. Usually someone will write code to do something and then post it online, and if it's popular enough a lot of people will use it and fix any bugs it may have. In like 99% of cases it's ideal to just find a good library that will do what you need done because it's already written, so you save time and chances are it's less biggie than whatever you'll write. Lazy programmers are more likely to just go find a library vs someone else who may just hop in and start coding shit. I have one friend who is the farthest thing from a lazy programmer, and we had a school project for machine learning. He was working on one version of our project and I on another. I finished mine in a few hours and he finished his in 2 days. When we compared the code, mine was like 400 lines of code compared to his several thousand lines of code. The difference was I used TensorFlow whereas he coded his own neural network with lots of tunable parameters. It's like two people saying hey I need to get from point A to point B, and one person buys a car while the other builds it from scratch. Edit. We eventually used my model and I worked on coding some other portions while he worked on writing our paper, and he had learned enough about how everything works that he turned our required 10-page size 12 font print paper into a 16-page size 8 font paper. And then he went on and turned our minimum 15 minutes presentation of our project into a 45 minutes lecture.